Over 100 years ago, a new philosophy came on the scene. It's called social justice, and it's popular amongst Christian religions. Social justice divides everybody generally into two categories: the oppressors and their victims, the oppressed. Initially, it just said that we should treat our neighbor with the moral rightness of theology and religion. Okay, that's not a bad thing. As it crept into religious circles, though, the leaders of the movement said that Jesus came to bring social justice to society and free the oppressed. Well, most of us Christians can see some truth in that statement. Yes, Jesus came to set us free from the oppression of sin, but not necessarily from all the wrongs of society. Yes, He will someday bring justice to the people on earth, but justice for society now just wasn't the focus of Jesus when He walked on the earth as a human. The concept of social justice expanded out of religious organizations and became about financial oppression that needed to be rectified by redistribution of wealth and property. And then the idea of social justice continued to expand into areas like the environment, race, gender ideology, even highways. Have you heard government officials say that highways are socially unjust and we need to fix it? Lately, social justice has become an advocate for equity. Equity means that social advantages and disadvantages need to get redistributed equally among all classes of people so that nobody has more or less than anybody else, regardless of how hard they worked or how smart they are. The social justice movement has become embedded in many Christian religions, but its philosophy is mostly secular. It's not spiritual. It's all about fixing society and societal wrongs, when in truth, Jesus was all about fixing men's hearts on the inside. Jesus did see a category of people as oppressed, a group that needed deliverance from oppression, and that was demon-oppressed people, of course. Jesus actively worked to free people who were victims of demonic oppression. He also established a system of atonement and healing for the victims who were oppressed by their own sin. We do see some teachings by Jesus about how to live together, and how to live together in a way that's going to lead us away from one person oppressing another. But we don't really see Jesus coming against the social pillars of oppression, like the social justice movement seems to think He did. They're just using Jesus and Christianity, I think, to justify their own progressive political views. So I'm noticing all the talk about equity and social justice, and at the same time, I'm learning about life in the time of Jesus. And I came across two stories in the Gospel of Luke that describe the interactions of Jesus with a person who's oppressed, and by contrast, His interactions with a person who would be considered an oppressor. Actually, there are lots of stories like these, but these are just two that are right beside each other, and they also give us some great insight into the thinking of Jesus when He comes to oppressed people and oppressors. And in the process of looking at these stories, I'm going to give you some background, some local color. I'm going to illuminate for you how the people at the time were actually thinking. How did the Jews of the day see the beggar blind Bartimaeus? What did they think of people like this who were obviously oppressed on every side, physically and financially? And then we're going to dig into what the Jews of the day thought about tax collectors, Jewish collaborators with Rome, the obvious oppressors of the people. Well, let's dive into these stories and see what the Lord has for us, okay? Turn to Luke 18:35 through 43. Luke 18:35 through 43. As Jesus was approaching Jericho, a blind man was sitting by the road begging. Now, hearing a crowd going by, he began to inquire, what was this? They told him it was Jesus of Nazareth who was passing by. And he called out, saying, Jesus, Son of David, have mercy on me. Those who led the way were sternly telling him to be quiet. But he kept crying out all the more, "Son of David, have mercy on me." Jesus stopped, commanded that he be brought to him, and when he came near, Jesus questioned him, "What do you want me to do?" And he said, "Lord, I want to regain my sight." And the Lord said to him, "Receive your sight. Your faith has made you well." Immediately he regained his sight and began following him, glorifying God. And when all the people saw it, they gave praise to God. The story of how blind Bartimaeus was healed. This story is also told in the Gospel of Mark, and it's in the Gospel of Mark, in Mark's telling of the story, that we discover that this blind man was named Bartimaeus. In Hebrew, bar means son of, and timaeus means unclean or filthy. Saying that someone was a son of something was a Jewish idiomatic way of describing that person. The psalmist used this kind of idiom. Here, let me show you. Psalm 89:22. Psalm 89:22. Then I'm going to tell you something unusual about Jesus. 89:22. The enemy will not deceive him, nor the son of wickedness afflict him. Son of wickedness here means a person who's consumed with evil. Today we might call a trucker a son of the road because they're driving on the road all the time. Son of man, what Jesus called himself, meant in those days a human being as opposed to a deity or a god. Did you know that that's what Son of Man meant? Every time Jesus referred to himself as Son of Man, he was emphasizing the fact that he was incarnate, that he was on earth not as God, but as man. Now, he was a spirit-filled man, but he was making sure that everybody knew that he was a man nonetheless. So maybe this man, Bartimaeus, was the son of someone named Timaeus, unclean, or maybe they just referred to him as an unclean person. I think it's probably the latter because he'd been born blind. Remember, the Jews of the day saw the world as a dichotomy. Everything could be divided into two categories: clean or profane, unclean. Clean meant it was consecrated, holy, belonged to God, like the nation of Israel, the temple, the altar, etc. Everything else was profane, not belonging to God, not touched by God. Here, let me show you how they thought about blindness in those days. John 9, 1 through 2. John 9, verses 1 and 2. As he, Jesus, passed by, he saw a man blind from birth. And his disciples asked him, "Rabbi, who sinned, this man or his parents, that he was born blind?" This is the beginning of a story about another blind man. And when the disciples see this man and that he was born blind, the thinking of the day was that they were absolutely certain that somebody was profane or unclean for this to have happened. It was either this guy's himself or his parents that had done something wrong. Now, I can't imagine how the fetus could have done something wrong, but, that made it unclean, but apparently the disciples could. Notice that in their minds, there was only one possible conclusion here about what happened, and that was that somebody had done something wrong. It couldn't have been an accident of nature. It couldn't have been caused by an evil spirit. No, it was something that the parents or this man did that made him profane or unclean and thus rejected by God. Now, if you go on down to verse 3, Jesus answered the disciples and said, "It was neither that this man sinned nor his parents sinned, albeit it was so the works of God could be displayed in him." Now, Jesus explains that their myopic thinking is wrong. My translation says that he was born blind so that the works of God might be displayed. And that almost sounds like God made the man blind so he could heal him. Sort of a Munchausen by proxy act of the Father. But I think the more correct literal translation here is, albeit let the works of God be displayed. In other words, Jesus told them not to focus on the why, but to focus on God's plan for eventually a good outcome. Well, let's go back to blind Bartimaeus in Luke 18. Okay, Luke 18, 36 through 39. Luke 18, 36 through 39. Now hearing a crowd going by, Bartimaeus began to inquire, what was this? They told him, it's Jesus the Nazarene who's passing by. And so he called out, Jesus, Son of David, have mercy on me. And those who led the way were sternly telling him to be quiet. But he kept crying out all the more, Son of David, have mercy on me. Bartimaeus calls to Jesus, and the crowd tells him to hush up. Now we know that the crowd had a preconceived notion about this blind man. They discriminated against him because he was profane or unclean. They were good Israelites. They were holy. But this man had obviously done something against God to make him unclean. Bartimaeus. We see here a man oppressed on every side. He was oppressed by his condition of blindness, but he was also oppressed by the people around him. How dare you take the time of the master? Jesus is important, you're not. So obviously the blind beggar is looked down on by all the people. Now we could say that he's oppressed in two ways. He's oppressed by his own physical condition, but he's also oppressed by the people around him. We've already seen that the people would see him as profane or unclean. I mean, it's right in his name. But he's also poor, a beggar. When most healthy, normal Jews looked at a poor beggar, it would have been difficult for them not to look down their noses at him. I mean, after all, if he was a hard-working, righteous man like me, then he wouldn't be in these circumstances that he's in. Look at Leviticus 19:14, though. Leviticus 19 and verse 14. You shall not curse a deaf man, nor place a stumbling block before the blind. But you shall revere your God. I am Yahweh. So Torah had something to say about how you treat blind people. Don't take advantage of them. Of course, that doesn't mean you have to like them or respect them. But there's something else interesting about the Jews of the day. They actually wanted to have at least one beggar in each town. Let me explain. The Torah commands you to give alms to the poor. Go to Matthew 6, verse 2. Matthew 6, verse 2. Jesus says, so when, not if, but when you give to the poor, when you give alms, do not sound a trumpet before you, as the hypocrites do in the synagogues and in the streets, so that they may be honored by men. Truly I say to you, they have their reward in full. When you give to the poor, Jesus says, what he's doing is he's referring to the requirement to give alms to the poor. Jews understood the concept of sowing and reaping. They knew that if you wanted a blessing, you should give a blessing. They knew that by giving alms, they were opening the door for financial blessings to flow their way. Consequently, they regularly gave alms to the poor. Oh, they didn't give much at any one time, but they filled in the requirement of giving alms so that they could receive a blessing. So in a way, the town beggar was actually doing a service for those in town. So if in your town you didn't have a beggar, you couldn't give alms, and if you couldn't give alms, then you couldn't be blessed. Plus, the town beggar was providing another service to the givers. He sat in the public. He gave people the chance to give in public, and so everybody could see how generous they were to, the person was to the beggar. Some people were giving alms to enhance their reputation as how pious they were, like the religious leaders of the day. Oh, now I understand why Jesus was so upset at all this. Let's go back and reread Matthew 6, 1 through 4, okay? Beware of practicing your righteousness before men to be noticed by them. Otherwise, you have no reward with your Father who's in heaven. So when you give alms, do not sound the trumpet before you, as the hypocrites do in the synagogues and in the streets, so that they may be honored by men. Truly I say to you, they have their reward in full. But when you give to the poor, Do not let your left hand know what your right hand is doing, so that your giving will be in secret, and your Father who sees in secret will reward you. How humiliating that must have been for a beggar when someone of wealth came up and started blowing a trumpet to get attention, to make sure that everybody watching knew that this big, important, rich man was giving alms to this lowly, worthless beggar. But it didn't end there. After the beggar received the alms, no matter how small, he would stand up and shout that the giver was the most noble person he'd ever known. And then the beggar would proclaim a blessing of grace and increase for the giver, his family, all of his associates, and blessings on his going out and his coming in, and blessings of all good things. No wonder what Jesus was so upset with this kind of public display. What a perversion of God's heart and his laws. They may not treat the beggar very well, but that beggar was an important part of a Jewish town. I've got to have you around, but you don't have to mean a whole lot to me, and I don't have to like you. Did you know any of this about Israel and beggars at the time of Jesus? I thought it was fascinating. Let's look at the milieu of this story. Milieu. It's a big word that just means the environment or the context, what was going on around the occasion of this story. First of all, you have to understand the word crowd there in Luke 18. The Greek version of this word means a throng, a noisy rabble. That wasn't Jesus slinking along with his 12 apostles, hoping that nobody would notice him. No, this is late in his 3.5-year ministry. And he'd been doing miracles, teaching long enough. He'd been developing a reputation. The scene takes place as Jesus is on his way to Jerusalem, where his entry into Jerusalem is going to be met with palm leaves and shouts of Hosanna, and blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. Remember when Jesus fed the 5,000 and later the 4,000? Having great crowds of people following Jesus was the norm, especially since they were convinced that he was Messiah, the Anointed One. Go back to Luke 18, 37 through 38. Luke 18, 37 through 38. They told Bartimaeus that it was Jesus of Nazareth passing by, and he called out, saying, "Son of David, have mercy on me." Notice that in verse 37, that the crowd tells the beggar that Jesus the Nazarene is here. And then in verse 38, Bartimaeus immediately knows who they're talking about. They're not just talking about some guy from Nazareth. They're talking about Israel's future king, their Messiah. That's what Bartimaeus is saying when he calls Jesus Son of David. Everybody in that day knew that Messiah was a descendant of David. Everybody of the day knew that not just anybody could do what Jesus did. No, he had to be from God to do these miracles. They concluded that he wasn't just some prophet along the way. Man, he was the real thing, the Messiah, the Anointed One, their deliverer. And so at this point, the people treated Jesus as a dignitary, a king. Well, not the religious leaders. They wanted to kill him. But the common people, they knew better. They knew that this was their king, and so they thronged around him wherever he went. As he's coming into Jericho, the town leaders are probably meeting to figure out how to honor Jesus. He's coming to our town. We've got to show him extraordinary hospitality. We've got to throw a big banquet for him and show him great honor. Whose house is going to host this great celebration for our coming king and honor him in our town? Put yourself in that crowd. Man, you're up close and personal with the king. Remember this, because we're going to come back to it when we look at the next story about the oppressor, Zacchaeus. Well, anyway, back to verse 37. They tell the beggar that all the fuss is about Jesus the Nazarene. And everybody of that time knew that meant Jesus, the coming Messiah. So in verse 38, Bartimaeus calls out, "Son of David." That's code of the time for Messiah, the king. Look what else Bartimaeus says. He says, "Have mercy on me." Well, at least that's what my translation says. But we've talked about this before. Almost everywhere in the Old Testament and New Testament that you see the English word mercy, the underlying Hebrew or Greek word is not mercy, but empathy and compassion. The Greek word here is actually a very interesting word. It means to have such empathy and pity for someone that it moves you not just to feel compassion for them, but to actually do something to help relieve their suffering. The English word mercy is all about suspending or reducing punishment for somebody that's guilty of a crime. Bartimaeus isn't asking for a reduced sentence. He's asking Jesus to pity him and have compassion on him, and let that compassion drive Jesus to help him in a way that nobody ever could. But man, notice the reaction of the crowd. How dare this nobody disturb Jesus and his people? How easy it is for us to value one human being over another. We are all equal of value and importance to the Lord. But we work so hard to try to determine who's the most valuable. Your job or your task assignments, they don't establish your value. I got to meet and spend some time with the Vice President of Guatemala, and at the time, both the President and the Vice President were outspoken Christians. When local people found out I'd spent time with the VP, they acted like I was now somebody important, and they wanted to talk to me. They had all kinds of questions about what was he like I had become some kind of celebrity. But the truth was that the VP was just a man like any other man. Oh, he had a big assignment. The VP of a country has massive authority. They have massive responsibilities too. But at the end of the day, they're just people. And that vice president is just as important and valuable to God as the poorest widow woman in the poorest village of that country. You'll see later how Jesus expressed his attitude about equality when he meets the oppressor. Well, anyhow, the crowd tries to stop Bartimaeus, but he's persistent. Go down to Luke 18, verse 40. And Jesus stopped, and he commanded that Bartimaeus be brought to him. And when he came near, he questioned him. So in response to the cries of the beggar, Jesus stops and he commands that Bartimaeus be brought to him. I think this is ironic. Those who were disrespecting and denigrating the beggar a moment ago, they're now told to become his escorts. Those who are so busy being the self-proclaimed protector of the rabbi, they've become, in essence, the servant of the beggar. Notice that Jesus didn't just say, let the beggar come forward. No, Jesus made it a point to tell the crowd of oppressors to become the humble guides of this person, Bartimaeus, who was so important to Jesus, but not to them. In a way, Jesus was giving a mild rebuke. I think he was chastising this crowd. They were acting like oppressors of this beggar, and Jesus wanted them to know experientially his absolute love. The act of Jesus stopping whatever he was doing to take time to talk with this profane beggar, Jesus was giving the crowd a chance to sense his compassion, his great compassion for everyone, even a lowly blind beggar. Do you know what Jesus is doing here? He's starting a prayer ministry session when he gets this guy to come up. He's going to take his time, he's going to listen to the Holy Spirit, and he's going to make himself available to the Father so the Father can use him to do something for this hapless beggar. We go down to verse 41. Jesus asked the question, what do you want me to do for you? And he says, Lord, I want to regain my sight. What do you want me to do for you? Jesus says. Well, duh, he wants his sight restored, right? Why would you ask? Well, I think it's more complicated than that. Here are a few things maybe you ought to consider, like John 9, 31 through 33. John 9, verses 31 through 33. This is the blind man who had been healed there in John 9. We know that God does not hear sinners, but if anyone is God-fearing and does his will, he hears him. Since the beginning of time, it's never been heard that anyone opened the eyes of a person born blind. If this man were not from God, he could do nothing. Who ever heard of the healing of a man born blind? To these people, healing of a man born blind would have been mission impossible. I mean, don't ask for that. Don't ask for the impossible. You'll just get your hopes up and then you'll be disappointed. I know that there are people listening to me today with lifelong conditions. You may have a genital heart defect or asthma or arthritis since you've been in your 30s, or maybe you're a woman in a family that has a history of breast cancer. Whatever it is, it's been around so long and seems so familiar that you can't even imagine being healed. Maybe you've prayed for years and seen no results. Listen to me. God is the God of the impossible. Maybe you've been praying for this healing for years. Don't give up praying now. What do you have to lose? If you don't have faith for healing, then pray for hope at least. You know, hope for healing will breed faith. Here's another thing to consider about this question. I've heard people say that God knows what you need before you ask. Well, obviously that's true. But sometimes I hear them go on to say that that means that you don't have to be specific in your prayers because He already knows what you need. Or some have even thought that you don't have to pray at all. Well, God knows what you need and He'll take care of it. So why bother asking God for something if He wants me to have it? If He wants me to have healing, then He'll heal me. Well, that may sound pretty logical, but that's not what we see in the Bible when it comes to prayer. John Wesley said, God does nothing on this earth save through believing prayer. I believe that's true. Here, look at James 4, verses 2 through 3. James 4, first New Testament book written. Starting in the second part of verse 2, you do not have because you do not ask. You ask and do not receive because you ask with wrong motives, so that you may spend it on your own pleasures. You do not have because you do not ask. How about John 16:24? John 16:24. Jesus talking to His disciples, until now you've asked for nothing in my name. Ask. It's a command. Ask, and you will receive, so that your joy may be full. Jesus actually commands us to ask for what we want or need. 1 John 5:14. 1 John 5, verse 14. This is the confidence which we have before Him, that if we ask anything according to His will, He hears us. God always hears when we pray His will. Well, why in the world would I ever want to pray anything other than God's will? So I want to pray for my wants and my needs. I want to make sure that those prayers line up with God's will. Oh God, let me buy a winning lottery ticket. Well, maybe that's not God's will. Oh Lord, you know that my neighbor doesn't treat his wife right. Make him divorce her so I can marry her. Probably not, right? Lord, I need to pray about this, but I don't know what your will is in this. God has a solution for that little problem. What is God's solution? Well, I'm going to leave it as a cliffhanger, okay? You'll have to come back next time to learn about one of God's gifts that He's given us that can be used when we don't know how to pray. It's a special gift just for your prayers.